Hi guys, this is CS MGTOW. The idea that men are the more violent gender is a pervasive one, even among men, many of whom proudly identify with the image of the brute, unthinking nether-ape, ready and willing to assault, maim, and kill others at the behest of his honor, his wife, tribe, government, or God. The male warrior hypothesis represents another sterling example of when dogma comes before the data, and ideas are advanced before all of the facts are in. It is driven by the idea that evolution has shaped men to be warriors, or to put it more specifically, that men are biologically programmed to form coalitions that aggress against neighbors. The second part of the hypothesis suggests that men uniquely enjoy and benefit from violence, aggression, and killing. The goal of my video today is to answer what I believe is one of the most important, yet undiscussed issues that will lead us to a better understanding of men. A question that is yet to be addressed without the taint of bias, prejudgment, or political agenda. To answer this, I'm going to be answering a series of smaller but certainly interrelated questions. For example, are there simpler and better fitting hypotheses than the male warrior hypothesis? How do women behave in situations when they have power? Are men really more violent than women? Is the answer to global violence as simple as let's empower women? Has female suffrage and their political participation reduced the likelihood of war? Do men actually enjoy violence, as the male warrior hypothesis supposes? Before starting this video, it's important to note that this male warrior hypothesis forms the backbone, often unwittingly, of a number of social and legalized norms that uniquely harm men. The first of which being the military service standards globally, which almost universally force men into combat roles which women are exempt from. Secondly, the age-old question which forces many an intercity cop to have sleepless nights, which is why do men gather in gangs? Thirdly, the decreased sentencing for female violence offenders versus their male counterparts rests on the notion that violence is out of character for a woman and very much in character for a man. Fourth, when two men are fighting others, specifically other men, or simply stand back and let them fight to, quote, get it out of their system, unquote. After all, they're warriors, and that's what warriors need from time to time, hey? And lastly, the desensitization to male physical and emotional pain. After all, warriors are stoic, unfeeling, and impervious to pain. The motivation for this video came from two sources. The first of which is the tiring but often repeated notion that men are the source of all important societal violence of note. And secondly, a research article published by Melissa McDonald, Carlos David Navarrete, and Mark Van Goot. The paper is titled Evolution and the Psychology of Intergroup Conflict, the Male Warrior Hypothesis, and the link can be found in the description bar. According to this hypothesis, intergroup conflicts represents an opportunity for men to gain access to mates, territory, and increased status. As such, conflicts may have created selection pressures for psychological mechanisms in men to initiate intergroup aggression. In women, intergroup conflict substantially increases the risk of sexual assault by outgroup men and may have created selection pressures for psychological mechanisms that bias women against outgroup men. Stardust the Thinking Ape recently put out an absolutely excellent video, one of his best videos in recent times in my opinion. And the video was titled Assortive Mating as a Delimitative Factor in Male Ideological Behavior. I've linked to it, it's an absolutely fantastic video, and I would actually urge you to watch that video before continuing with this video. The reason for this is that Stardust has done an absolutely superb job of highlighting the evidence supporting the fact that women do not have an automatic psychological mechanism that biases them against outgroup men, as the authors of the male warrior hypothesis suggests. In fact, we have seen time and time again a phenomenon that has been titled the war bride phenomenon, where females are able to switch allegiances to outgroup men with relative ease, as evidenced by women who began sleeping with Nazi soldiers during the occupations of World War II. So at the very least, the second part of the male warrior hypothesis, which states that selection pressures form psychological mechanisms that bias women against outgroup men, is most certainly a false one. In the remainder of their article, the authors present their arguments for the male warrior hypothesis and its specific predictions about the psychological significance of intergroup conflict and the differential reactions of men and women. A number of direct claims and indirect inferences can be taken from their paper. Firstly, that male violence is natural and inevitable. Secondly, that extreme forms of violence for evolutionary reasons are uniquely male. In other words, that lethal violence is a sexually dimorphic psychological adaptation to the problem of mate guarding, sexual selection, and resource acquisition. Thirdly, that empowering women will reduce societal violence and internecine conflict. My video today will aim to explore simpler and perhaps better fitting assumptions based on the available evidence. Firstly, I ought to say in advance, I'm not here to insult your intelligence. I am aware that any partially historical or social explanation of male violence and dominance, of course, does not eschew biological factors, but it might minimize them. Whenever we analyze the human ape, it's important to do so within the context of selection pressures. So just before I begin the crux of my argument, let's explore the physical capacity for violence. Consider the biological fact that men have far more upper body strength than women, and assume that both men and women want to obtain as many desirable resources as they can. In hunter-gatherer societies, this strength differential doesn't allow men to fully dominate women, because the men depend at least partially on the food that women gather. But things will of course change with the advent of intensive agriculture and herding. The strength differential gives men an advantage over women once heavy plows and large animals became central aspects of food production. With this, men became the sole providers, and women started to depend on men economically. Furthermore, due to selection pressures, the smaller, less physically able men would face real challenges obtaining reproductive partners. Hence, most men are larger than women. So even when we deliberately leave conflict to the side for a moment, there are logical and consistent with the available evidence reasons for men's superior strength. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the topic of male violence, the capacity to kill, and the psychological readiness to do so. I'm going to be turning to a book authored by Melanie Joy. It's titled, Why Do We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows? Melanie addressed an undeniable issue that has changed the face of training of the military. Specifically, that there is a very substantial body of evidence demonstrating humans' seemingly natural aversion to killing. Much of the research in this area has been conducted by the military. Analysts have found that soldiers tend to intentionally fire over their enemies' heads or not fire at all. Studies of combat during the French Napoleonic and American Civil Wars revealed striking statistics. Given the ability of the men, based on their very rigorous and standardized military training, their proximity to the enemy, and the capacity of their weapons, the number of enemy soldiers hit should have been well over 50%, resulting in a kill rate of hundreds per minute. Instead, however, the hit rate was only 1 to 2 per minute. And a similar phenomenon occurred during World War I. According to British Lieutenant George Ruppel, the only way he could get his men to stop firing into the air was by drawing his sword, walking down the trench, and beating them on the backside telling them to fire low. World War II fire rates were also remarkably low. Historian and US Army Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall reported that during battle, the firing rate was a mere 15 to 20%. In other words, out of every 100 men engaged in a firefight, only 15 to 20 actually used their weapons. Marshall revealed that as many as 75% of soldiers never fired their weapons in combat. His basic conclusion that the majority of soldiers will not return fire during combat if left to their own devices has been corroborated by evidence and accounts from other wars, including the American Civil War, World War I, and the more recent Falklands War. So let that sink in. He's not saying that men will not only not try to kill others, it actually goes deeper. Men will not return fire even when actively fired upon by an enemy, unless physically beaten or otherwise threatened by their officers. What these studies have taught the military leadership is that in order to get a soldier to kill, to actively participate in violence, the soldier must be sufficiently desensitized to the act of killing. In other words, they have to learn not to feel responsible for their actions. They must be taught to override their own conscience. Yet these studies also demonstrate that even in the face of immediate danger, in situations of extreme violence, most men are actually quite adverse to killing. In other words, as Marshall concludes, the vast majority of combatants throughout history, at the moments of truth, when they could and should kill the enemy, have found themselves to be conscientious objectors. Furthermore, in World War II, only 1% of pilots accounted for 30 to 40% of enemy fighters shot down in the air. Some pilots didn't shoot down a single enemy plane. A very interesting statistic when you think about it. As military leaders gained a better understanding of the human ape, we see a real shift in killing effectiveness over history. By the time of the Korean War with America in 1950, the rate of soldiers unwilling to kill an enemy decreased and 55% of soldiers fired at the enemy. In Vietnam, this rate increased to about 95%, but it doesn't mean they were trying to hit the target. In fact, it usually took, according to the available data, 52,000 bullets to score 1 kill in regular infantry units. This gives us our first clue that the male warrior, if such a person ever existed, might be anatomically equipped to deal out death and violence, but on a psychological level is extremely reluctant and totally unprepared to actually do so. After all, the evidence for the male warrior hypothesis should be visible in the thoughts, emotions, motivations, and behaviors relevant to intergroup conflicts among men in times of extreme duress such as war. But the real-life evidence shows the opposite. Men had to be trained to take life, and even after the normalization of this act, they did so in such sufficiently low numbers that military training had to be adapted specifically to cope with this. The question that we might ask is, are humans a pure tournament species? The proponents of the male warrior hypothesis believe that we are. Evidence suggests otherwise. It's also interesting to note that as a sexual strategy, extremely violent men are often not attractive to the majority of women. Psychologically, it seems, women want a man who can resist the violence of others. This expressed need by women, who are of course the limiting factor in reproduction, seems to have drastically impacted both the psychological and anatomical makeup of men through sexual selection. That is, we are left with men who are anatomically built for violent confrontation, but simultaneously emotionally unwilling to initiate violence and take life. So on some level, men's increased physical capabilities point to a purely defensive purpose, and that is to protect the human female and her offspring, as opposed to raiding enemy towns, killing at will, and raping for fun. Evolutionarily, men do not quite seem the psychopaths we're painted as. Of course, I expect to receive a large number of comments and messages to the effect that most massacres, wars and violence have been initiated by men. Absolutely, this is indeed the case. Here I would counter that these cases represent outliers, or evolutionary spandrels. That is, that they are phenotypic characteristics that are a byproduct of some other characteristic rather than a direct product of adaptive selection. The authors Melissa McDonald, Carlos Navarez, and Mark Van Good's position is quite clear. War, violence, and conflict are uniquely male pursuits. That is, that humans are, for all intents and purposes, a pure tournament species. Here again, we can absolutely turn to the available research. After all, firstly, if warfare were uniquely a male pursuit, then warfare would have declined precipitously with women's suffrage. Secondly, if their hypothesis is correct, then we would find women less likely to participate in acts of violence against strangers or close kin. The propensity for women to kill young children and violently assault their offspring is well documented. For the benefit of those unfamiliar with this data, I will outline it briefly. However, I'm keen for this not to become the evidence that I fall back on here. There are other far more interesting studies, which perhaps ought to help illuminate our thinking on this topic. In 2001, the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health collected data about the health of a nationally representative sample of 14,322 individuals between the ages of 18 and 28. The study also asked subjects to answer questions about romantic or sexual relationships in which they had engaged during the previous 5 years and whether those relationships had involved violence. From this information, researchers found that of the 18,761 relationships, 76% were non-violent and 24% were. Of the 24% that were violent, half had been reciprocal, half had been not. Reciprocal meaning that there was violence inflicted by both partners. What they found was that more women than men, 53% versus 49%, had experienced non-reciprocal violent relationships. More women than men, 52% versus 47%, had taken part in one involving reciprocal violence. The statistic that was undoubtedly to myself the most striking was that the researchers pointed out that in the 71% of non-reciprocal partner violence instances, the instigator was the woman. This flies in the face of the long-held belief that female aggression in a relationship is most often predicated on self-defense. Furthermore, while injury was more likely when violence was perpetrated by men, in relationships that featured reciprocal violence, men were injured more often, 25% of the time, than women, who were injured 20% of the time. Jem Brown, executive director and founder of the Domestic Abuse Helpline for Men, stated that domestic violence is not about size, gender, or strength. It's about abuse, control, and power, and getting out of these dangerous situations and getting help, whether you're a woman being abused or a man. It's worth noting that violence is not an issue of size. Here we will see, a little later on, please be mindful of this, that the male warrior hypothesis falls rather short of the real-life observations here. Okay, so secondly, on screen right now you're seeing a graph of the frequency of wars. It was taken from a paper by Mark Harrison and Nikolaus Wolf, and their paper was titled The Frequency of Wars. The authors state that wars are increasingly frequent and the trend has been steadily upwards since 1870. And they also point out, rather interestingly, that the main tradition of Western political and philosophical thought suggests that extensive economic globalization and democratization over this period should have reduced appetites for war far below their current level. The website Women's Right History Project gives the timeline for women's suffrage as being signed into law in 1920. Combining these two sets of information, we see that women's suffrage has had no effect on the number of militarized disputes between countries. Of course, I am aware that many countries exist without wholesale female political participation, and they, of course, do engage in violent conflict. So perhaps we might turn to the USA, where since 1940, the US military budget has not dropped significantly. We still have wars of foreign aggression despite female suffrage. It's also interesting to note that women who do gain power, like Margaret Thatcher, Hillary Clinton, and Condoleezza Rice, are often hawkish, suggesting that power, not gender, determines belligerence. Again, as Jan Brown, executive director and founder of the Domestic Abuse Hotline for Men, suggested, power, not gender, determines belligerence. Women are just as abusive and violent as men, perhaps even more so, since men are less likely to call the police for help, and women are notorious for calling the police for help, even when they have not actually experienced violence, or they are the actual perpetrators of the violence. Across the cultures, irrespective of the scenario, we see the evidence suggesting that violence is a gender-neutral issue, contrary to the male warrior hypothesis, which portrays violence as a uniquely male adaptation. According to Cindy D. Ness, in her book Female Terrorism and Militancy, Agency, Utility and Organization, during recent conflicts with Russia, 43% of Chechen suicide bombers have been women. And in Stanley Milgram's classic experiment, women were at least as likely as men to administer what they thought were harmful electric shocks. And then one also might look at Zimbardo's classic prison experiment, where he looked at social roles in causing cruel behavior. This experiment has been replicated with women as well, and here is Zimbardo summarizing one result. To investigate this, I created an experiment. We took women students at New York University and made them anonymous. We put them in hoods, put them in the dark, took away their names, gave them numbers, and put them in small groups. And sure enough, within half an hour, these sweet women were given painful electric shocks to other women within an experimental setting. I apologize if I'm laboring the point here, but it seems that while men are certainly more able to inflict and resist violence, there seems to be very, very little real-life causal link between this increased anatomical capacity for and the desire to kill. The desire and willingness to kill, maim, or even assault seems to be just as prevalent in the human female, who has been documented to initiate intimate partner violence far more frequently and volunteer as suicide bombers just as frequently. This, coupled with the fact that men, even in times of war, actually deliberately try to avoid killing, tells us that this male warrior hypothesis is flawed in at least one way, perhaps two or even three. You see, the notion that for men, intergroup conflicts represents an opportunity to gain access to mates, territory, and increased status ignores a number of facts about the nature of the physical world, female mate preferences, and biological drivers. Firstly, while lethal intergroup conflict certainly does represent an opportunity to gain mates, territory, and increased status, men have had, since the hunter-gatherer days, perhaps even sooner, other far more effective means to increase their status and to gain access to mates, and that is very, very specifically resource acquisition. You see, for the individual man, war has always been a zero-sum game, one that is at odds with his two deepest biological drivers, the first of which is the desire to reproduce, and the second, the desire to stay alive. Going to war to raid an enemy camp placed him on a roulette wheel, one in which the house always won sooner or later. Sooner or later, no matter how talented a warrior he was, he would be cut down by a more talented adversary or simply killed with a lucky arrow shot. The other ways to increase his social status, specifically resource acquisition through labor, gave the individual man and the tribe a number of distinct advantages over senseless killing. Specifically, firstly, it's just less physically dangerous. Secondly, as a result, it is more in line with his biological driven urge to reproduce and stay alive. And thirdly, it is unlikely to lead to violent reprisal by the close kin of those slain by he or his tribe members. So going back to my earlier questions, firstly, is there a simpler and better fitting hypothesis to the issue of male violence? I believe so, and that is that physical size combined with a reluctance to aggress against others are traits selected for they represent a reliable external marker, that is in the case of physical strength, of a man's ability to resist aggression, as well as a reluctance to carry out acts of violence against those who look to him for protection. I guess what I'm saying is that his partner wants him to defend her against others, not to raid enemy villages. Secondly, my other question was, how do women behave in situations where they have power? We do have some examples. When women have power over children, we see rates of increased murder and violence towards those children. Also, while we do have a limited number of examples, it is very, very clear that women who manage to dominate political spheres of influence display the same levels of belligerence as their male counterparts, suggesting that power corrupts, not gender. The third question I asked was, are men really more violent than women? Has female suffrage and their political participation reduced the likelihood of war? And is the solution, let's empower women? Based on the available data, violence is not a gendered issue. There is no drop in defense spending or the number of wars since female suffrage. Empowering women further or having more female political leaders will not reduce interpersonal or national conflict. The fourth question I asked was, do men enjoy violence as the male warrior hypothesis supposes? Based on the kill rates of the soldiers in the conflicts that my video has explored, it would seem that men are hardwired to be reluctant to take human life. This proved such a significant hurdle for military leaders that they had to train the minds of men into killing, in addition to providing training on how to aim and shoot a rifle. Painting men as warriors allows society to be morally comfortable with the idea of drafting only men, packing men in jails to live like animals, and sending men to die when the need arises. Thank you very, very much. This is CS MGTOW.